been a pretty productive flathead season this year, and I'm just going to run through in this video the setup that I used for this year, plus I'll run through, I guess, the lures that I've used over the last couple of years, and when I'd use them and how I'd use each one when I talk about retrieves and techniques. So I've got the rod, reel, line, hard body divers, micro stick baits, soft plastics, metal lures, and then a few 1%ers. When I'm out chasing flathead, I'm usually using sort of a 7-foot plus rod. So the one I've been using most of the year is an 8'6" Daiwa Hyper, which is a 2 to 5 kilo rod, but it's over 8.6 foot long. So you really get a little bit more on that casting distance. It's not a perfect rod. It has its drawbacks when you're sort of trying to net a fish with such a long rod when you're 50 meters out in water. I've also used this one the year before, which was the just your standard Shimano Raider. I think this was 7'6" or 7 foot, something along those lines. So just that little bit longer than your normal brim rod, so you get a little bit further casting distance. Having said that, I've caught plenty on my 6'8" rod as well, but if you're looking at maximising what you've got, then going for a longer rod on the flats will just give you those longer casts and allow you to cover more ground. When it comes to reels, I love my Stratic 2500 with 4-pound braid, and then I use 8 to 10 pound leader, just so that I can avoid getting rubbed through, and they're not overly leader shy. I'll sometimes go down to 6 if it's really a flat day. So we'll start off with the most common sort of lure that is used for bartail flathead in the Swan River, which is hard body divers, pretty much because of the blowfish. Soft plastics would probably be, I think in my mind, the most effective, but the blowfish are really annoying. Also, the issues with weed can make soft plastics a bit harder to use on the flats. The first one I've got here is a zip bait, comes in junior, so this is a 50mm lure, so this is probably the smaller side of the hard bodies that I would use. I'd go to the 50mm lure when I'm not necessarily, canvassing or covering a lot of ground. I'm casting to a specific area. So in this instance, there was a line of seaweed, and I was literally making my way up the line of seaweed, casting, retrieving slowly. I'll use this lure a lot more like I'd use a brim lure, where it's a little bit of a slow retrieve. You can still do those erratic sideways flicks of your rod though, but yeah, it's a little bit slower retrieve than I would with some of those larger lures where I'm going for more of that reaction bite. I got a giant herring actually with this lure earlier in the season as well, so and a few trout, so it's pretty versatile. The other lure that I've been using a lot this year is a Zip Baits Riggy in 70. So I've got this in black and gold. That's sort of the old school classic Swan River colour to go to. So with the Riggy, I'll cast it out, and it casts probably a little bit further than the 50mm just because it's a little bit heavier, and I will wind it in a little bit quicker. I'll also use more of the ripping action when I'm reeling it in. I really want to get that reaction bite, so after a big rip, hoping a flathead will come and smack it. This was a deep diving version, which was great when there wasn't too much seaweed or stringweed around, or if you're casting along the side of the weed bed, you'd get a little bit further distance, and then I'd rip the rod sideways to give a little bit of a reaction to try and get that bite. It was probably one of the more productive lures over the season. As you can see here, I'm reeling in a lot more faster than I would with other lures. This is still also in probably about 30 centimeters of water here as well. So pause and then the rip. In the third category of the hard bodies, we're looking at the double clutch 95. So you've probably seen a lot of my other videos where I use this quite a bit. It's just that little bit bigger, so you get that little bit further casting distance. It's a pretty well-known classic. One thing I'd say when it comes to the 1%ers for the hard body lures is ensuring you've got really sharp small gauge hooks. So with the flathead, they've got really, I guess, hard mouths, and they can often blunten your hooks, or when you take it out you might snap a treble, or if you're using a landing net you might get your hooks caught up in the net and your rear trebles will get all over the place. So carrying a few spare trebles in your bum bag or your backpack so you can swap them over when they're ruined will help you stop losing fish. Another thing that I often do, if I'm waded out sort of 30 meters into the water and the rear treble's all messed up after getting bent out of shape, is I'll swap the treble from the front treble on the lure with the back treble, so that way the rear treble is always the most sharp. One of the more productive style of lures that I started using this season is a micro stick bait. So usually when I'm in the weedy conditions or there's heaps of stringweed around, I'd probably go straight to the ZX Vibe. But this year I still use the ZX, but I also started using the micro stick baits. Basically, when you're retrieving these, you don't have the weed getting stuck between the line and the bib on the lure. So you will still foul up here and there with weed, which is almost unavoidable, but it comes from 50% of your cast being fouled up by weed in those horrendous conditions to 1 in 6 or something along those lines. So there's been a lot of stringweed this year in certain areas, which have made it almost unfishable with hard body divers. The other time I would use this lure, if I'm casting into situations where I've got to use a little bit of finesse and I don't want a big splash where my lure lands. For example, here I'm going to cast into really shallow water. There's a little creek here which meets the rest of this laked up water in the Swan here, so I'm going to cast along the edge just where the creek meets, and I think that there could be a flathead there, but I don't want to get too close and spook things or have a big lure land in there and make a big splash. So I'm hoping this light little stick bait will land nicely on the surface and I can slowly work it back with little flicks of the wrist. Perfect. So I really like this lure in those sort of 10 to 20 centimeters of water, or working across the brush in those sort of mid-tide situations where there's going to be fish along the edge there and you don't want to spook them or get fouled up in the weed. This lure also gets you a lot of nice bycatch with black bream in the river as well. If the weed is also really bad, where it's to a point where it's getting caught in the middle and the back treble, you can take off both trebles and just put on 2 of the little assist hooks at the back, similar to like you would with one of those ZX Vibes. That's another way you can also use this lure to catch whiting as well. When I lived over east for a little bit, catching the big duskies, I'd always go to soft plastics. It was my favourite way to fish for flathead. Here in the Swan it can be a little bit more frustrating. Having said that, it's still a really effective way, and I find if you use some of the bigger soft plastics, you can be a little bit more blowy proof. Also, if you're fishing for flathead from basically Maylands towards Guildford, the blowies aren't as much of a problem, and usually pretty good using your small 2.5 inch Z-mans and grubs without having the blowies wreck them. Here I'm further upstream and I'm just gone to my sort of bin of soft plastics and found a pack of Streaks 4-inch Z-Mans. I used to use these for catching bass back in the day as well. These are great little lures, and they're a little bit more tough, and they've got a bigger tail, so if a blowy takes a chunk out of it, you can still use it after a few more casts. Having said that, I had a few chomped on this session as well. So when I would go to use the soft plastics more, if there's like a channel of water that I'm fishing in where there's a drop down and I want to bounce it through the channel like I am here, or on those drop offs, so those areas where you're fishing the flats and it drops off quickly, or if you're on a kayak and you want to sort of slowly make your way along a drop off. And I've got, I think, a 2.0 jig head on here with a fairly decent hook. The good thing with the soft plastics, once you hook them and you hook them good, they'll usually stay on, as long as they haven't absolutely engulfed the lure and you have to worry about your leader getting rubbed through. But with these sort of 2.0 to 3.0 jig heads, usually pretty alright. And don't be afraid of putting a big jig head on if you're using a 4-inch or a 5-inch lure. My new favourite little hobby at the moment is using micro jigs. This works perfectly on that 8-foot 6 rod too. So here I'm just doing the 3 flicks up technique. So I've cast out as far as I can, let it sink to the bottom, flick up 3 times. I've been using micro jigs from that 5 gram to about 15 gram. I would say 10 grams is a good place to start. Good with that 4-pound line so you can really feel where the jig is. So with the micro jigs, I'll often again fish those drop-offs, but because they cast out so far, they're another good prospecting lure as well, where you just cast out a 10 gram lure as far as you can on the flats along some nice broken weed areas or areas where you know that you've caught fish before, and just hop it back. Thanks for watching. If you've got any questions about how I catch flathead in the Swan River, feel free to ask in the comment section.